this is a talk about the Longchen Nyingthig, but this is also, I think, Women's History Month or something like that. And so that being the case, I realized almost everybody in this list of the Longchen Nyingthig is male. And so we need to have a few female masters to be brought to light here. And so I wanted to mention kind of before the talk on the Longchen Nyingthig, just for a minute, everybody should kind of keep in mind there are these two wild women named Nyingma and Sukasiddhi. Nyingma was maybe the brother of Naropa, and they were kind of responsible for the founding of the Shangpa Kagyu, but there's not a lot of details about their life stories. Another major master was Machi Glabdron, who founded the entire traditions of Chud. There's a whole series of traditions, but she was the primary founder of the Chud practices, which have to do with cutting the ego by doing strange, difficult things, hanging out in graveyards and stuff like that with a thigh bone trumpet and a drum and a bell, and doing chanting and practice in sort of dangerous situations in order to realize that you don't have to be completely connected to this attachment to the body and life that we take so seriously. So Machi Glabdron is somebody that we should know as an incredibly valuable practitioner and master of early Buddhism. She was in the 1100 to 1200 period, the 12th century. And so we have Nyingma and Sukasiddhi, and then Machi Glabdron, and then there are two other masters that were between the 1800s and early 1900s, including Shuksep Rinpoche, a great master, and Sarakandro. And so I'll talk a little bit about them at the end if there's time, but it looks like it's going to be kind of a crowded hour, but I can skip over some things if need be. So the main thing I kind of want to show you, first of all, where this is going. And I think I'm kind of officially starting now, if that's okay. And I'm Richard Kingsland, if you don't know me. And I've been a student of Rinpoche for a long time, since 1970, when there were about 25 of us at Webster Street before there was a Padma Ling, and then eventually there was Padma Ling, and then the Nyingma Institute, and that's where we're talking from now, sort of. But I'm going to get to, I have a bunch of slides, kind of, but I'm going to show you the first one, which is kind of the most important one in the sense, because it shows you what the lineage really is. So let's see if I can do that. Share screen, yeah. Can you guys see that okay? Yep, okay. Yeah, start from first slide and so forth. Yeah, I want all of us to kind of look at this slide for a little bit, because it's very important. It really is the Longchen Nyingthig directly to our teacher, Tarthang Tulku Rinpoche. And on the left side of the screen, it shows these kind of mythical but very real people, Garap Dorji to Manju Sri Mitra to Sri Shingha. Sri Shingha and Garap Dorji are extremely important. Manju Sri Mitra is kind of the go-between between those two. Sri Shingha was a major teacher of Vimalamitra, Jnana Sutra, and ultimately Padmasambhava, and one of the first great translators, who was one of the 25 great disciples of Padmasambhava and Vimalamitra, named Vairocana. So they have in common that they all studied under Sri Shingha, who was born in southern China and had a place at something that was called the Bodhi Tree of China. There was a temple there, and he studied and practiced there. So Vimalamitra and Jnana Sutra and Manju Sri Mitra all kind of studied with Sri Shingha. Well, Sri Shingha studied with Manju Sri Mitra, but that's a whole connection over there, which is the sort of foundations for what they call the Vima Nyingthig, which means the Nyingthig. Nyingthig means like heart essence or heart drop. And so it's the Nyingthig, the heart essence of the Vima lineage, kind of. So the Vima Nyingthig is on one side, and on the other side, this is just to show that there are two different kind of major roots to the Longchen Nyingthig. And the two major roots are the Vima Nyingthig on one side and what's called the Khandro Nyingthig on the other side, which was founded by Padmasambhava to his daughter, Princess Pema Tsal, who died at age 8. And Padmasambhava inscribed on her heart as she died the letter Hri and entrusted her subsequent emanations to be holders of a slightly different Nyingthig, a heart essence, the Khandro Nyingthig. And so ultimately, the Khandro Nyingthig, Princess Pema Tsal, was reborn as Pema Ledrel Tsal in around 1275 or near the 1300. And then 2 generations later, Longchenpa appears and gets the full transmission of the of the Khandro Nyingthig from the terma that Pema Ledrel Tsal found, and also from Pema Ledrel Tsal's immediate student, so that Longchenpa received the full Khandro Nyingthig as well as the Vima Nyingthig, ultimately, which he received from his own teacher, Kumaraja. This is Longchenpa. The major central figures are Vimalamitra, Padmasambhava to Longchenpa. Now, they're widely apart. I mean, Vimalamitra is 700s, as is Padmasambhava. Longchenpa is 1350-ish. So we're talking 600 years apart to get to Longchenpa, who synthesized the 2 Nyingthigs into a coherent kind of whole. And then ultimately, 400 years later, Jigme Lingpa, a great visionary master, receives all kinds of teachings in visions from Longchenpa and Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava, and he becomes the final synthesizer of what became known as the Longchen Nyingthig, which is coming down to us in the next several generations, right directly to our teacher, Tarthang Rinpoche. Jigme Lingpa's main students included Jigme Nyingthig, who was the teacher that Patrul Rinpoche, his student, referred to in the book Words of My Perfect Teacher. That's Jigme Nyingthig, who Patrul is referring to. Patrul was an unbelievable, great kind of wandering master himself, who was a teacher to Azom Drukpa. Azom Drukpa was another incredibly great master in the late 1800s. His son was Gyurme Gyaltse Dorje, who was a direct teacher of Tarthang Rinpoche. So we're getting it directly from the follower, from the teacher to student of Jigme Nyingthig to Patrul to Azom Drukpa to Drukpa's son and spiritual heir to our own teacher, Tarthang Rinpoche. On the other side of the Jigme Lingpa lineage tradition, there's the great and wild man Do Khyentse Rinpoche, and then subsequently Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo the Great, who really was an incredible master, who synthesized. He was a master of masters. He was an authority on all 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but he was a Terton himself also, and he worked with Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche, who was kind of a Nyingma, kind of a Kagyu guy, to put together and synthesize all the teachings of the Nyingthigs together. So these 2 together did an enormous service to the Dharma for all of us in the late 1800s, along with Chogyur Lingpa, who was a great Terton himself. And then the rebirth of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo was Jamyang Khyentse Choki Lodro, direct teacher of our own Tarthang Rinpoche, his primary teacher. And Jamyang Khyentse of Dzogchen, who was also a teacher of our own teacher, Tarthang Tulku Rinpoche, and subsequently to Dilgo Khyentse, who was also a teacher of our teacher, Tarthang Rinpoche, and kind of independently, Dudjom Rinpoche also to Tarthang Rinpoche. So all these lineages together, we are inheriting directly through our own teacher. It's kind of amazing if you think about it. So that's the overview of where we're actually going with this talk, but I'll sort of talk a little bit about most of these people, but that gives you the flow of where it's going in order to reach us. Does anybody have questions or anything about that they'd like to bring up? Because that's kind of the overview picture of where we're going and how incredible it is that we are inheritors to some extent of these direct heart essence teachings primarily through the Nyingma school. And I'm going to show you a few pictures of these guys, because they're all guys. It's Garab Dorje, followed by Manjushri Mitra, followed by Sri Shingha, complete wild yogi guy. And then to our great master Padmasambhava. I love this. This is an actual statue that existed from Padmasambhava's time that was blessed by him, and he called it same as me, looks just like me. And it was destroyed in the Cultural Revolution from when the Chinese invaded, but that's what he actually looked like, according to himself. And then to Vimalamitra, or Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava together received the Nyingthig teachings and passed them on, along with Trisong Detsen, the great king that brought them two together, along with Shanti Rakshita. And then probably the greatest translator of the time was Vairotsana, a student of both Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava, and one of the great 25 disciples of Padmasambhava. Ultimately followed in the 1300s by Longchenpa, there he is, and subsequently by Jigme Lingpa in the 1700s. There's Jigme Lingpa again. He's got this kind of special little beard there. And Do Khyentse, another wild guy that was a completely miraculous inheritor from Jigme Lingpa. To Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, Master of Masters. Along with Jangwon Kontro Lodro Taya, these two, along with Chogyur Lingpa, were great synthesizers in the 1800s that really brought the teachings into the level of teachers that can have brought it to us. And there's Chogyur Lingpa, and I think the final one might be Dilgo Khyentse, probably. Yep, there's a Dilgo. So Dilgo actually came, to Berkeley. We saw him. He did a weekend ceremony with Rinpoche at Padma, as did Dudjom Rinpoche. So the early on, some of us had the great good fortune to meet with both Dilgo and Dudjom Rinpoche. So that's the main picture. But now I'm just going to sort of start talking about, if I can figure out how to maybe stop share. Go back to, there's everybody, hi. And I'm going to sort of begin to talk about who's who and what's what, but you have the overview now, at least you see where it's kind of going. So first I should talk just a kind of very brief review of Buddhist history. So Shakyamuni, the Buddha of our times, was 550 BC, roughly, mid-6th century BC. And he put together the Four Noble Truths, the 12 links of independent or dependent origination. And then a couple of centuries later, Alexander the Great actually came all the way to the Indus River, conquering most of Asia up until he met in the huge armies of the Indian emperor and was defeated at the Indus. But he left people behind that kind of were responsible for taking care of the area of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Alexander the Great traveled with he had several philosophers with him. He was tutored by Aristotle himself. So the guy liked philosophy, even though he's an incredible world conqueror. But the point is that the Greek influence then began to interact with the influence of the great masters at Takshila, which was a university in Gandhara, which is in western Pakistan, near the Swat Valley, which is the same area roughly where Udayana is said to be, where Padmasambhava is said to be from. But Taxila was a very important center of learning, and there was an interchange between the Greeks and the Buddhist thought at that time. So that's kind of an interesting notion of how we're actually connected earlier, the West, with the early Indian Buddhists than we would have expected. And then the next major figure that I'm going to mention is just Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor of India in the 3rd century BC, roughly in the 200s BC. And he had conquered large parts of northern India. And when he conquered the area of Kalinga, which is in current Odisha, there were 50,000 dead on the field, and he just said, never again am I going to war. And he became a Buddhist. And he's the first one who actually put a railing around the Bodhi tree, and it became an area of veneration under Ashoka. And his daughter ultimately married the prince of Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka became Buddhist at that time also. And they took a branch of the Bodhi tree and planted it in Sri Lanka. So there's another Bodhi tree in Sri Lanka that's based on the original one that we've gone to visit a number of times if you've been to the Monlams at all. So Ashoka in the 3rd century expanded the Buddhist ideals across all of India with these rock edicts about Buddhist ideals and how you should be good to each other and help each other and provide a way for commerce and all manner of things that were based on Buddhist ideals. And then in the 2nd century CE, so now we're talking 500 years after Ashoka, we get the beginnings of writings by Nagarjuna and others, which really was kind of an expansion of the Theravada tradition into something that subsequently became the Mahayana tradition, which included the concept of, or the idea of shunyata, the bodhisattva ideal, and the Mahayana kind of orientation by Nagarjuna, 2nd century, followed a few centuries later, basically in the 4th to 5th centuries, by Asanga, Vasubandhu, and Dignaga, who were founders of both the Abhidharma and the Yogacara schools of Mahayana Buddhism. So you can see there's a progression that takes centuries to happen, but it begins with the Buddha himself, followed by institutional support by great emperors, followed by Nagarjuna and subsequently the great philosophers and scholars at the major universities of the time, which included Nalanda and Odantapuri and Vikramashila. There were 3 major universities in Bihar by the time of the 5th and 6th centuries. So, and then in the 8th century, you have Padmasambhava, Shantarakshita, and Trisong Detsen. The 3 get together. Trisong Detsen calls them to Tibet, Shantarakshita and Padmasambhava and Vimalamitra, to provide a base for Buddhism in Tibet. And that's an amazingly kind of lucky thing, because 300 years later, the Mughal Islamic huge sets of conquerors come and absolutely destroy every aspect of Buddhism in India by the 1100s. But by the 800s to the 1100s, in Tibet, the great translators and transmitters from India had provided a very solid basis for the continuation of as many of the lineages of thought, philosophy, and practice that the Indians had produced, kind of kept in this mountain fastness of the entire area of Tibet, which was kind of difficult to get to, difficult to get out of, but a beautiful place to be and a beautiful place to practice. So it's kind of important that Buddhism found a home in Tibet before it was destroyed in its own homeland in India in the 1100s to 1200s. So what's happening now, actually, with Wangpo's efforts and Rinpoche's efforts, is that there's a resurgence of interest in the homeland of Buddhism in India now. And finally, the government is beginning to decide, wait, this brings in tourism. There's a lot of dollars that can happen from this. And we want to support our own history anyway. So it's an amazing thing to see how it comes and goes and flows from India to Tibet to ultimately the West, and then back to South India, back to Southeast Asia, and then resurgence of interest in India as the homeland of Buddhism. So that's an overview of more than you needed to know. But we're talking about the Longchen Nyingthig. So the Longchen Nyingthig kind of begins with the history of Dzogchen. And Dzogchen is considered the pinnacle of Mahayana thought. It's actually Tantrayana, which is the most rare level of Mahayana thought. And In the last, there was a talk recently last week by Lama Palzang and Pema, and they were talking about Maha, Anu, and Ati Yoga. Maha Yoga has to do with visualization and generation phase practices, primarily visualization and mantra. And then Anu Yoga has to do with the prani, the bindus, the winds, the energy flows in the body in various yogic practices. And Ati Yoga is considered the heart of Dzogchen itself. And within Ati Yoga is the originators of Ati Yoga were these first four that we're going to talk briefly about. Garab Dorji is the founder, or the first. This is the direct lineage of Dzogchen, which is the highest yoga of Tantrayana, Ati Yoga. And so Garab Dorji was apparently, he was sort of, there was a son of a king in Odiyana. The king was named Uparaja. He had a wife and a daughter, Sudharma. Sudharma was devoted to Dharma studies and became a nun. She lived on an island in a lake and had a dream one night of an immaculately dressed, white-robed guy who put a crystal vase with syllables Oma Hum Svaha on her head 3 times. 9 months later, she gives birth to this beautiful little boy, but she's afraid no one will believe her. She's not married. How is she having a baby? That's not a good thing. And the social structure at the time. So she decides he must be an evil spirit of some sort and throws him in an ash pit. But then beautiful sounds start coming from the ash pit for a couple of days. And then her attendant, who is a Dharma student herself, takes out this baby and finds it's beautiful, perfect little baby. And then the child was apparently unharmed for 3 days. So Sudharma knew that he was an emanation of some kind of deity and named him Garab Dorji, or Laughing Vajra. And when he was young, 7 or 8 years old, he asked to meet with a congregation of scholars of the Dharma and convinced them all that he had enormous teaching knowledge at age 7. He later spent 30 years in practice at various charnel grounds where he had direct visions and instructions from Vajrasattva in person. He later met his primary student, Manjushri Mitra, who studied and practiced with him for many years until Garab Dorji dissolved into rainbow light and dropped a small gold casket into Manjushri Mitra's hand with a teaching called the 3 syllables that hit the heart. The 3 syllables are in Tibetan, and they consist of simply 3 syllables, but they can be interpreted in many pages of a description of what they actually are conveying. But 3 syllables that hit the heart was kind of what Garab Dorji passed into Manjushri's hands when Garab Dorji dissolved into rainbow light. The next one in line is Sri Shingha, who was born in southern China, studied the Dharma for a number of years, and became an accomplished scholar. He studied for 30 years as a monastic, an ordained monk. He then had a vision of Avalokitesvara, who encouraged him to seek out Manjushri Mitra in the charnel ground of Sosadvipa in India. He practiced deeply for several years until he gained signs of accomplishment. And then through miraculous speed walking, apparently this is one of the things that some of the great adepts develop, is this idea that you can move really quickly by just kind of fast walking that barely touches the ground. And he made his way to India, met Manjushri Mitra, with whom he practiced the Great Perfection teachings for a number of years. The next 2 in line are Vimalamitra and Jnana Sutra. Jnana Sutra was born to a lower caste family in eastern India, and Vimalamitra was born in western India, but they met when they were both studying with hundreds of other students in Bodh Gaya. They became close friends because they had an earlier karmic connection from previous lives. This is Vimalamitra and Jnana Sutra. One time they're walking together, and Vajrasattva appears to them and says, if you really want to attain enlightenment in this very body, you better go to the temple near the Bodhi tree in China. Vimalamitra heard it and said, I'm out of here. I'm going to China right now. And so he goes and sees Sri Shingha, finds Sri Shingha, who was staying near the Bodhi tree in China. And he studied with him for 20 years and received enormous amounts of teachings, but did not receive the full teachings and texts of the Nyingthig itself. He returned to India and passed on his teachings to his friend Jnana Sutra. And Jnana Sutra said, I'm out of here. I got to go find Sri Singha myself. So he goes to the Bodhi tree in China and studies with Sri Singha for 12 years. Sri Singha then gives Jnana Sutra the full teachings that he had given to Vimalamitra, as well as the hidden texts, which he retrieved from the temple near the Bodhi tree in China. Sri Singha then gave Jnana Sutra a series of profound empowerments, and Jnana Sutra stayed in practice with him for another dozen years. He then left, heading south because a king had invited him to the country of Li. But while he was on the way there, he heard a loud noise in the sky and saw his master, Sri Singha, seated in a mass of light, and realized that his master's mortal body had dissolved. Jnana Sutra offered many prayers, and into his hand fell Sri Singha's final testament, the 7 Nails. Sri Singha also told him to go to the Basing charnel ground near Bodh Gaya, where he would find the texts of the inner esoteric teachings of the Nyingthig. Vimalamitra came to see Jnana Sutra when he arrived at the charnel grounds in India, and Jnana Sutra gave him, Vimalamitra, all the teachings and empowerments that Sri Singha had passed to him, and entrusted Vimalamitra with the Nyingthig teachings. Vimalamitra then stayed and practiced with Jnana Sutra for an additional 14 years. So these guys spend a lot of time practicing together. And they're all kind of based on teachings that Sri Singha had received. Jnana Sutra himself then passed into rainbow light, leaving a small jeweled casket containing pith verses to Vimalamitra, who attained equal realization to that of Jnana Sutra. Vimalamitra traveled throughout Western India for a number of years, practicing tantric teachings until he attained the light body of great transformation beyond life and death. Then, while he was teaching at Kashmir in the court of King Indrabhuti, he was invited to Tibet by an emissary from Trisong Detsen, the king of Tibet, to come to help establish the Dharma there. He left Kashmir for Tibet, and supposedly the trees along the way bowed towards him as he went. When there, Vimalamitra began to translate and to teach, along with the great Indian master Padmasambhava, who had been invited around the same time. Meanwhile, the great Tibetan translator and yogin Vairotsana had been exiled to Yarong, which is way in eastern Tibet, way at the border of where Tibet meets China. If you go to Chengdu, which is in western China, and you look up, there's a series of kind of hills that go just straight up from basically more or less sea level to 10,000 feet, which is where Tibet begins. And right at the edge of that, there are raging rivers and forests and all kind of things. That's Yarong. And that's actually where Lama Palzang is from. It's a kind of a wild place in Tibet, far eastern, high on the plateau, just outside of the border of what used to be China, or where the border of China used to be. So Vairotsana himself had been exiled to Yarong. Vimalamitra convinced the king to bring him back from exile. And along with Vairotsana and others, Vimalamitra spent the next 15 years translating the Mahayoga, Anu Yoga, and Ati Yoga texts into Tibetan. His series of cycles of heart essence teachings came to be known as the Vima Nyingthig, because these are transmitted by Vimalamitra, primarily initially to Vairotsana and to King Trisong Detsen. Meanwhile, Padmasambhava has his own series of Nyingthig teachings that he's received, also from Sri Singha and many others. And he eventually passes them on to the dying daughter of King Trisong Detsen named Pema Sal, the princess. And eventually they become reawakened when the reincarnation of Pema Sal becomes Pema Ledrel Sal several hundred years later, who eventually, the transmissions head to Longchenpa. So the two streams are coming together. They all come from Garup Dorje, Sri Singha, Manjushri Mitra, Jnana Sutra, and Vimalamitra. But the other side is from Padmasambhava, and they all come together in the 25 disciples of Padmasambhava and Vimalamitra. So the crux to the issue in the transmission to Tibet is the meeting of Shantarakshita, the great abbot of Nalanda, along with Vimalamitra from Kashmir, Padmasambhava from North India, and the transmission to Vairotsana, the great translator, and the other of the great 25 disciples. Is that all making sense so far? I mean, it's complicated, but there it is. And you're getting the beginnings of both streams now. So you have the Vima Nyingthig and then the Khandro Nyingthig, because the princess was considered the basis of the Khandro Nyingthig, which was passed from Padmasambhava to her heart essence. Vimalamitra eventually concealed the text at Samye Chimpu. This is really kind of interesting because the very first monastic center built in Tibet was at Samye, which is some distance, maybe 30 miles from Lhasa, the capital. And there were real problems with building Samye. Shantarakshita was trying to help build it with the advice and direction of King Trisong Detsen. But every day they'd build something, and at night the spirits would come and destroy it or break it apart or tilt it sideways or do any number of weird things. And Shantarakshita said, you gotta call for Padmasambhava, who's really got the power that can make a difference here. And so Padmasambhava comes, and they eventually get Samye finished. And our own, Rinpoche's current place of residence, long time, is Odiana or Odian, which is sort of based on the format of what Samye looked like, a major central temple, 4 other temples around it. But Samye Chimpu is a retreat place that's up above Samye and became a place of several important caves where teachings took place. From Longchenpa himself spent a lot of time in Samye Chimpu. And so many transmissions have happened there. It's a very blessed place in terms of practice above Samye. So Vimalamitra concealed some of the texts at Samye Chimpu in this cave above Samye, or set of caves. And then he left for Wutai Shan, the 5-peak mountain of Manjushri in China, where he allegedly remains even today. And he said that he would send an emanation to appear in the world every century until the next Buddha appears. So some people say they've seen him at Wutai Shan. He shows up as a beggar or an unusual person that's there for a few hours, and then you never know where he goes, but he gives hints of some important teachings once in a while, supposedly. So Vimalamitra, through his practices, attained the body of transformation and is still present, allegedly, in Wutai Shan, the 5-peak mountain of Manjushri. So I'm going to talk a little about Padmasambhava. Everybody knows a fair amount about Padmasambhava because he's kind of the founder of the entire Nyingma tradition. But he's the founder along with the context of Vimalamitra, the 25 great disciples, and the great Trisong Detsen, along with Shantarakshita, the former abbot of Nalanda, the greatest Buddhist university of the time. So Padmasambhava is a completely miraculous being, found as an 8-year-old child in the heart of a lotus and adopted by King Indrabhuti. And when he was a medium child, maybe 10 years old or something like that, he had realized that he's not going to spend his life as a prince of a kingdom and that he needs to go study and practice as a yogin. And he needs to try to kind of escape from the kingdom. And he also realizes that there's a minister whose son has very bad plans that are going to harm other people significantly. And Padmasambhava drops his trident he's dancing on the roof of this building and drops his trident on this child that he sees from the future will have very bad karmic results if he allows anyway, the child is killed by the trident. The king gets terribly upset and realizes, you've just killed one of my subjects. You have to go. You have to get out of here, and you're exiled from my kingdom. So it served the purpose of allowing him to actually go and study and practice elsewhere, but he was banished from the kingdom by his own adopted father. So he received teachings and empowerments and various visions from Dakas and Dakinis, had visions of deities, At one point, he asked for an empowerment from a very powerful Dakini called Goya Jinyana, who turned him into the syllable hum and swallowed him, apparently, and then received inner, outer, and secret empowerments, and then emerged from her lower body, completely transformed in some ways. He went to the kingdom of Zahor, and there was a princess of the kingdom named Mandarava, who he realized would be an ideal consort, but she was supposed to be this immaculate, perfect person. And the king gets terribly upset about both of them hanging out together, and he burns them at the stake outside of his palace. 3 days later, the smoke clears, and he and Mandarava are sitting on a lotus in the middle of this lake. And through miraculous means, he's perfectly fine somehow or other. The king is completely blown away and gives him his outer dark red cloak and a hat. And that's how you often see Padmasambhava, as he's wearing the king of Zahor's cloak that was given to him after being burned at the stake with Mandarava. Don't worry, he gets burned at the stake more than once too. So it's, it's just the beginning. He only gets burned twice, but still, it goes back to Indrabhuti, gets kicked out of there, burned at the stake again, once again, another lotus. He's with these lotuses all the time for Padmasambhava. Born in a lotus, burned at the stake, turns into a sitting on a lotus in 2 different occasions. So let's see. After being burned at the stake and winding up on a huge lotus in the middle of another lake in Udayana, after he goes back there, he's sent away again, goes to Parping in Nepal, and takes on Princess Shakyadevi as a consort there. And she and Padmasambhava practice at Yangla Sho and in the Asura caves in Parping, which is just outside of Kathmandu. And I've been there to the Asura caves, and there's a handprint in the wall just right above when you walk in. It's a small cave, and that's where they practiced for a number of years. And apparently there was a drought and pestilence and badness in the area, in the region for several years. And so Padmasambhava sent back to India for additional texts on Vajrakilaya practices. And so he and Shakyadevi do the Vajrakilaya practices for several months, and the drought was overcome and the region rejoiced. He returned to India, studied with Sri Singha for a number of years, and was invited to Tibet by King Trisong Detsen. Shantarakshita was already there, and they were having difficulties building Samye. The difficulties were overcome once Guru Padmasambhava arrived there. Samye was completed, and he stayed and taught his 25 great disciples for some number of years with King Trisong Detsen and Yeshe Tsogyal as his consort. And Virochana and Nupchen Sanjay Yeshe, among others, were his most celebrated students. Along with Yeshe Tsogyal, he traveled all over the mountains, rivers, and plateaus of Tibet and hid secret teachings which were to be revealed later as terma. And Yeshe Tsogyal was responsible for kind of compiling and concealing these great treasure texts, which have been revealed over the centuries to consist of enormous numbers of terma teachings, which were formulated by Padmasambhava and concealed by Yeshe Tsogyal. He also went to Padmasambhava, also traveled to Bhutan, where he overcame negative forces there and obstacles and established the Dharma, appearing there as Dorje Drolo, riding on a tiger, which is one of the places in Bhutan is called the Tiger's Nest, Taksang, just outside of Paro, Bhutan, and it's way up on a cliff. I mean, you have to walk up for about an hour and a half to get to this narrow little spot, and there's a monastery stuck on the cliff. And pictures of him where Padmasambhava practiced in the form of Dorje Drolo riding on a tiger. So you often see that image, and it's associated with Paro Taksang, which is an incredible, beautiful place. So we're going to talk a little bit about Yeshe Tsogyal, who was born around 760 the Common Era, and previously manifested as Sarasvati, a great Indian goddess of knowledge and music. She was kind of seen as a Dakini, as an emanation of Samantabhadri, the primordial female Buddha, and also of Aryatara. Trisong Detsen heard of her miraculous qualities and abilities and beauty and sent for her to be brought to the palace, where she became his own consort and queen. Later, he set her free of any obligations and offered her to Padmasambhava, and she became Padmasambhava's disciple and consort. And she subsequently received every empowerment given by Guru Rinpoche. I'm not sure how she felt about being offered to somebody else, or that's seems a little odd to me, but things were different in those days, I suppose. And she was just an incredibly, we're so fortunate to have had her in our lineage, that she really devoted her life to providing teachings for the future. It's just unbelievable the kind of things that she did. And among these great teachings was the Khandro Nyingthig cycle, which she concealed as Terma, to be revealed by the Terton Pema Ledrel Sal in the 1300s, which is 500 years later. And the omniscient Longchen Rabjam, 100 years later, 60, 70 years later, is reborn from Pema Ledrel Sal, and receives the Khandro Nyingthig teachings from Ledrel Sal's student, because Ledrel Sal had passed away. And Guru Rinpoche, at the end of his life, or at the end of his time here anyway, departed for the southern continent, while she, Yeshe Tsogyal, remained for a number of years, departing her own physical body in a ball of blue light, heading to Guru Rinpoche's pure land of Zangdak Palri several years after Padmasambhava left. So Vairotsana, we're going to talk just briefly about, kind of the primary translator student of Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava. He was one of the first 7 monks ordained by Shantarakshita and became one of Padmasambhava's most gifted disciples. He was sent to India by Trisong Detsen to seek out teachings from as many Indian masters as possible, and was in India for several years, although I guess he nearly lost his life on 16 different occasions on the way there and back, and I think his compadre was actually drowned in a river on the way back. And eventually, Vairotsana becomes one of the most respected translators of the time, and guided by Padmasambhava, he edited the 8 Nyingma Heruka sadhanas, including those of Hayagriva and Vajrakilaya. He was exiled to Gyarong for several years because of some sub-minister argued that he was diverting the teachings or doing some things that were not appropriate somehow or other. He was sent way east to Gyarong, but he convinced the royal family there that he was fine. He was a major teacher, and the prince of Gyarong, Yudra Nyingpo, became a great student of his. And when Vimalamitra came to Tibet, he convinced the king to bring him back out of exile, bring Vairotsana back. So he and Yudra Nyingpo came back, and on the way to Lhasa, there's a famous image of him with a very old-looking guy next to him. And the old-looking guy is a guy named Gompo Mipam, who was 85 years old, and he really, really wanted to practice. He wanted to learn the teachings. And so Vairotsana gave him the full instructions for several months and taught him, you're probably not going to be able to sit up really well. So he said, just take this stick and hold it under your chin and you'll be able to sit up straight. And so there are images of him with his stick holding him up. He eventually practiced for an additional 20-something years. This older guy at 85 lived to be 105 and dissolved into rainbow body himself. So Vairotsana had enormous powers of transmission of teachings that he had received already from Shantarakshita, Padmasambhava, and subsequently Vimalamitra. There's one other major student of the 25 disciples that I want to mention. His name is Nupchen Sangye Yeshe. And it's important because following Trisong Detsen, the next king was Ralpa Khan, who was another great Dharma king, and then Longdharma, who tried to suppress the Dharma completely in Tibet and outlawed all monasteries, all monks, and suppressed everything until he was ultimately killed, and a more benign king was put in place. But Nupchen Sangye Yeshe was one of the 25 disciples who had studied with Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava. He was not a monastic. He was a white-robed, long-haired Nakpa family guy. And he and his extended family and friends had their own center where they'd practice together. But he became a very powerful kind of yogin. And so the king heard about him and said, "What are you doing practicing? I heard you have some kind of powers. Well, show me what you got." And Nupchen Sanjay Yeshe says, "Well, okay, okay." And he says, he takes his purbu and says, "Look above your head," and points up above him. There's a scorpion the size of a yak above the head of the king. And he says, "Now watch." And he moves the purbu in a particular way, and this ray flies out of the scorpion's mouth and smashes a boulder into dust next to him. And the king says, "Oh, oh, never mind. You can do whatever you want. You guys just keep practicing if you want to. That's fine. No monks, though, okay?" And so that was the beginning of the non-monk, white-robed, long-haired Tantrika tradition of householders that has been always present among the history of the Nyingma, unlike the other three schools. So it's kind of the origin of the Yogin tradition of non-monastic great masters, and it continues to this day, which included, say, Dujum Rinpoche, who was a householder, and other great masters, including our own Tarthang Rinpoche. So Nupchen Sangye Yeshe was important for the great powers that he showed, even under attempted suppression of the king at the time. Now we're going to jump way ahead to Longchenpa, because the two central figures after the original time were Longchenpa and Jigme Lingpa, the original time being the beginnings of Tibetan Buddhism with Shantarakshita and Vimalamitra and Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyal, subsequently Vairotsana. But Longchenpa synthesized the teachings of both the Vima Nyingthig and the Khandro Nyingthig, which became together, this new stream of teachings became known as the Longchen Nyingthig, which is what this talk is allegedly about, although we only have about 15 minutes left. So let me just talk briefly about Longchenpa and briefly about Jigme Lingpa, and we'll go from there. So we mentioned that Longchenpa himself was considered an incarnation of Princess Pema Sal, the daughter of King Trisong Detsen, who died at age 8, and was revived briefly by Padmasambhava, who inscribed the syllable Hri on her heart, later reborn as the Terton Pema Ledrel Sel in the 1200s, who revealed the Khandro Nyingthig as Terma. Pema Ledrel Sel was next reborn as Longchenpa in the 1300s, 1310 to 1360 roughly, who would fulfill both Padmasambhava's and Vimalamitra's intent by holding and propagating both the Khandro Nyingthig and the Vima Nyingthig teachings. At 27, he found his primary master in a remote retreat camp with 100 or so followers, and saw the great master Kumaraja, Rigzin Kumaraja, a great wandering master. Longchenpa saw him as Vimalamitra himself. The entire encampment moved every month from one wild place to the next. Kumaraja knew that Longchenpa would become his heart disciple and would ultimately become the carrier of the Vima Nyingthig. Longchenpa underwent many hardships, slept and meditated in a little barley sack in extreme cold and windswept conditions. But from Kumaraja, he received the entire Dzogchen transmission cycles. He then went to Samye Chimpu, there it is again, and other places to practice in solitude for the next 10 years. He attained enormous realizations and gave initiations into the Vima Nyingthig for the first time with many signs of great accomplishment. He also gave a full initiation cycle and teachings of the Khandro Nyingthig to 8 fortunate disciples at Samye Chimpu. All who were there experienced appearances of dakinis, rainbow lights, ethereal music, a rain of flowers, and all were filled with delight for the whole 10 days of the empowerments. Later, Longchenpa received visions of Guru Rinpoche, Yeshe Tsogyal, and Vimalamitra, all of whom gave him additional empowerments and requested that he continue writing and teaching. He spent many years in retreat and composed many of his writings, including the 7 treasuries, at a remote hermitage called Kangri Tokar. During a vision of Vimalamitra, he'd been entrusted with disseminating the Vima Nyingthig cycles. He then composed the Lama Yangtig, the innermost essence, the wish-fulfilling gem, which is made up of 35 treatises on the Vima Nyingthig. There was political turmoil in Tibet at the time, and he was kind of self-exiled into Bhutan, where he left hand and footprints in rock, brought forth springs of water, and brought many disciples to spiritual maturity. He eventually became a master of both Trekcho and Togyal, the highest teachings and practices of Dzogchen, which are referred to as cutting through and leaping over, or some people say Trekcho is like seeing there and Togyal is like being there. And he taught frequently on these subjects in his later life. He was one of the most accomplished scholars, teachers, and meditators in all of human spiritual history, but he remained a simple, kind disposition, never looking down on those less fortunate or kissing up to those of high social status, treating all who came to him with warmth and respect. In him, the 2 great pure streams of Dzogchen came through, the Khandro Nyingthig and the Vima Nyingthig, which he summarized as his Lama Yangthig and Khandro Yangthig writings. At the age of 56, he went back to Samye Chimpo, sat up in Dharmakaya posture, and passed into the original state among signs of rainbows, colored lights, and lovely scents of blooming flowers. He's an incredible giant among scholar practitioners, and he held the door open for all of us who have followed the Vajrayana path since. Now, briefly on to Jigme Lingpa, 1730 to 1800 roughly. At age 13, he met a great Terton, Tuktuk Dorji, immediately felt strong faith in him, who became his root guru. He entered into retreat for the next several years, showing signs of accomplishment and experiencing visions of Padmasambhava, Yeshe Tsogyal, Manjushri Mitra, and others. He began to see many of his past lives and composed his first major treatise, a commentary on the Lama Gongdu, at this time. He then exchanged his monastic robes for white clothing and longer hair of a tantric practitioner. While still in retreat, at age 28, he experienced an overwhelming and unbearable devotion towards Guru Rinpoche and sang prayers with tears falling. He entered a state of luminosity and saw himself riding a white snow lion through space, arriving what appeared to be the Bodhanath Stupa in Kathmandu. There he met a Dakini who gave him a beautiful small casket containing 5 scrolls of yellow paper and 7 clear crystal beads. The scrolls were written in Dakini script, which he was at first unable to decipher, but the script transformed into Tibetan before his very eyes, and he saw that it was a cycle of sadhana practice related to Avalokitesvara, entitled The Self-Liberation of Suffering. The protector Rahula then appeared to him in the form of a monk, paying his respects and awakening and acknowledging Jigme Lingpa's entitlement to the revelations. He later wrote of this experience that he felt an immeasurable sense of amazement, and as though all the words and their underlying meaning were stamped in my mind and awakened from the visionary experience, my awareness completely immersed in the supreme unity of bliss and emptiness. The entirety of the teachings of the Longchen Nyingthig, the inheritance that had been entrusted to him by Guru Rinpoche, was thus awakened within his being as a mind tear. And there it goes on, but eventually he kept his revelations secret for about 7 years and began bestowing empowerments 7 or 8 years later. And through the years, he kept his life going as a carefree yogi and a wandering mendicant, where he was in fact a fearless awareness holder, completely free and open within. He gradually codified the many teachings and practices of his Terma and composed the root text and auto commentary of his treasury of enlightened qualities, as an elucidation of Longchenpa's teachings and composed the Yeshe Lama, which has become the most comprehensive manual of Dzogchen in the Nyingma tradition. The 9 volumes of his collected works brought about a renaissance of heart essence teachings. Incarnations of Jigme Lingpa included Patrul Rinpoche, the speech incarnation, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, the body incarnation, and Khyentse Rinpoche, the mind incarnation. I'm going to just mention Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, who worked with Jamgon Kongtrul in the mid-1800s, 1820 to 1890s. The two of them were just absolute incredible masters who compiled all of the teachings into the Rinchen Terzode and many other great writings, which remain the kind of the central teachings of the Nyingma schools. And ultimately, the next incarnation of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo was Jamyang Khyentse Choki Lodro, who was our own teacher's main teacher. Tarthang Rinpoche's main teacher was Jamyang Khyentse Choki Lodro, another incredible master who mastered all traditions of Tibetan Buddhism and ultimately passed them on to Rinpoche. And another of Rinpoche's primary teachers was Jamgon Kongtrul of Dzogchen, the reincarnation of Jamgon Kongtrul the Great. And so he received the teachings of 2 of these great masters in their second incarnations. Another of Rinpoche's main teachers was somebody named Gyurma Gyaltse Dorje, who was the son of Azom Drukpa, another great practitioner who was a student of Jigme Gyalwe Nyugu, I believe. And then other 2 teachers of our own teacher include Dudjom Rinpoche and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, 2 great masters of our own time that were around and quite active in transmitting the teachings to the West in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s until they both passed on. And that completes the talk, more or less. There are more details, but I had to jump over much of them. But you get the idea. It's an astounding flow of teachings remaining kind of fresh by their ultimate recurring emanations, reformulating, refining them, but they're all consistent, all from the very first set of the Nyingthig through the Vima Nyingthig and the Khandro Nyingthig from the 700s. So we're very, very fortunate to be able to participate in any of these teachings, which have been held together through many generations of masters into our own teacher, Tarthang Rinpoche, and subsequently to us. So there you go. I'll take any questions if anybody wants, and then whenever we have to go, just let me know, Aaron, right? If there's any, is there anything in the chat box? Let's see what we got here.
Yeah. Linda wants to get a recording, so please send the request to the front desk email, and I'll send you out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we get a recording of transcripts? Yeah, okay. Whoever wants to receive the recording, please request at the thing that's listed there. There's also a Jetsun Tinli Chodron, descendant of Terdok Lingpa, ordained nun of Mindraling, who transmitted Nyingthig to Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. Yes, there are other great women masters, but they're not publicized enough. But it's important because half of our Western students are women as well. They should be. Yeah. Julia, do you have a question or you're waving?
Oh, I would just say that if you're interested in some of them, Khandro Rinpoche has a very interesting website that includes what's called the Mindraling History Project. And there are some really important female masters in the Mindraling lineage who are like essential to the continuity of the Nyingma tradition. Without them, maybe no Nyingma tradition, like that,
Yeah.
that's serious. Including Migyur Paldron, who's the daughter of Terdog Lingpa. And so Khandro Rinpoche, who's the direct line descendant of those guys, her site is khandrorinpoche.org,
Khandro?
Khandro Rinpoche.
Khandro?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I'll
So
look it
she's
up.
pretty great.
Yeah. Oh,
So
there are others.
she's a Minling master,
Yeah.
modern teacher who's teaching and is one of the very few women that I'm aware of who is called Rinpoche.
Yeah.
And
There's also Tsultrim Alyone, who is said to be an emanation of one of the great women masters, who's a Western person who's also a Lama. And there are a few others. There's Lama Tsering Everest, who was a Chagdug Tulku student and Lama, did full retreat and so forth. So there are a few, and I hope there will be more, and I hope we learn more about them
yeah.
because it's important.
Yeah, well, Khandro Rinpoche has been compiling the history of Mindro Ling, and so
Good.
it's a worthwhile look if you're interested in that history.
Right. Mindrling, one of the great Nyingma monasteries. There are 6 mother monasteries of Nyingma, and Mindrling is one of them, along with, what are they? Katak, Dorje Dzogchen, Mindrling, and there are 2 others that I'm missing at the moment, but there are 6 great monasteries that have had lineage traditions for centuries now. Katak, I think, was one of the earliest, starting around the 6th century. And Katak had a hill across the way from it called the Slope of 1,000 Robes, apparently, because so many of their great students and practitioners at the end of their lives decided to go to that hill and just vanish. And so their robes are left behind. So yeah, the great monasteries hold incredible traditions over many centuries. Anybody else? Anything else?
Richard, what
Yes.
could you give an example of a Nyingthig teaching? Is it an essay of pithy sayings? Could you provide a little bit more as to what this tradition is?
Well, I don't really know there's a number of titles you may have heard, but I haven't read them because I don't think they're even translated into English for the most part. But yes, there are pithy sayings.
I was just curious in terms of what was passed down in terms of the practices, sayings, essays,
Yeah.
what it was,
I think
what
there's even,
constituted it.
well, there's the 7 treasuries, and one of those is called the Treasury of Pith Instructions, and so you can actually buy that book and read them. And that's by the 7 treasuries by Jamyang Khyentse, maybe, or by, not sure. There's not a separate kind of group of 10 volumes together that constitute um, the Longchen Nyingthig. There's a series of Nyingthig teachings. All of it's part of Ati Yoga, and Ati Yoga is considered really kind of uh, essence without form or structure, kind of. It's a little like kind of open, fearless confidence itself um, that is an awakening in and of itself without elaboration somehow. So it's really the natural state, and realizing that wisdom, compassion, and emptiness are actually kind of one thing in a sense that they relate to each other in very open ways. But I don't have a list of titles for you exactly, but you can look up any of the uh, Treasury of 7 and the 7 treasuries anyway, and the Treasury of Pith Instructions. But there are others. Anything by that you can find by Longchenpa, kindly bent to ease us. There's Now I Come to Die, I think, is another one. There are a number of teachings by these guys, including Jigme Lingpa, and of course anything by Patrul Rinpoche, which is in the direct lineage. So whatever he learned is kind of a result of the entire wave of tradition that he followed. Patrul I always love, and Mipam is another great recipient of the entire flow of the um, Longchen Nyingthig traditions, and he was one of those brilliant elucidators of all kinds of things. So anything by Mipam, the Ju Mipam, the 1920 to or early 20th century instructor. So those guys would give you the best taste of what the Longchen Nyingthig consists of. And it's a synthesis of the Vima Nyingthig and the Khandro Nyingthig, and those are in some sense related to the original instructions of open space by Garab Dorji initially, who was said to be kind of an emanation of Manjushri or any actually of the Adi Buddha himself, supposedly, or some Samantabhadra. He's the Nirmanakaya. He's the first human form. If the earlier ones are kind of from different realms, then they would include Vajrasattva as the Sambhogakaya and the Adi Buddha as the Dharmakaya, and then Garab Dorji as the first Dharmanakaya, going from sort of naked truth to immanent truth to present in the world truth, going from Dharmakaya to Sambhogakaya to Nirmanakaya. So, yeah, best I can do, Hugh. Anybody else? Anything else? Because we're ready to wrap it up, I suppose, unless anybody wants to hang on for anything further. I'm still here. If not, then thank you for coming. I appreciate it, and hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
masterful.
You're
Thanks so
welcome.
much.
Glad
Very
you
I'll
were
have to study it more.
Yeah,
For
we all have
sure.
to. No downside to it. And practice more too.
Yes.
That was an awesome chart too. Thank you.
Want to see it again? It's
Ye-
still here. Hold on. I can get it for you, I think.
Actually, could you share that slide with us maybe if you send it to Hariam?
Sure. If I'll contact Harry and see, because this slide is a good flow chart for